honor de presentarles al profesor Freedberg. Formado en la Universidad de Yale, donde obtuvo su licenciatura cum laude en clásicas, el profesor David Freedberg es doctor en filosofía por la Universidad de Oxford desde el año 84. Imparte clases en la Universidad de Columbia, donde desde el año 2000 obtiene el prestigioso título de profesor Pierre Matisse de Historia del Arte. En esta misma universidad también dirige la Academia Italiana para Estudios Avanzados en América. En esta universidad, además, comparte este trabajo con la publicación de libros y las conferencias impartidas en centros muy prestigiosos de todo el mundo. También ha comisariado exposiciones de arte contemporáneo. Reconocido internacionalmente por sus trabajos sobre la respuesta psicológica al arte o la relación entre arte y ciencia, con la obra de referencia El poder de las imágenes, que está traducido en español por Cátedra en el año 92, sin embargo, sus primeros trabajos de investigación se centraron en el arte flamenco, incluida su tesis doctoral, y especializándose con posterioridad en la historia del grabado holandés y en las pinturas y dibujos de Bruegel y Rubens. Ha abordado también el arte italiano romano del siglo XVII, en concreto su interés en Poussin. Estos dos intereses, el flamenco y el francés, se han visto en las conferencias que ha impartido aquí en la Fundación Amigos del Museo del Prado y en dos libros. Uno es Historias inmortales y el otro es Historias mortales, uno del 2002 y otro del 2004. Como gran especialista en arte flamenco que es, ha realizado programas también para la BBC sobre Rubens y escrito, además de los libros que tienen referenciados en la carpeta, multitud de artículos en revistas especializadas sobre artistas flamencos y sobre Dyck, que es el tema de hoy. Sobre la obra de Dyck tratará la conferencia de hoy titulada Los retratos de Dyck en el Prado, las conexiones españolas y flamencas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Nuria. You know, I so enjoy coming to the Prado, and I so enjoy giving these lectures to the Amigos del Prado that I promise, if I am invited again, I will give the next, at least the introduction of my lecture in Spanish. I am ashamed that I haven't yet learned to speak Spanish properly. But let me first of all extend my thanks not only to Nuria de Miguel, but also to the Duque de Soria, the president of the Fundación, for inviting me here again. As I say, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a marvel to visit the Prado, which, as you all know, I say to all my students in America, is the greatest of the museums in the world for the understanding of painting. You don't see better paintings in any other museum in the world. So I want to thank the Duque de Soria, I want to thank Nuria de Miguel, I also want to thank Ines Cobor, who has put up with hundreds of requests from me over the last few months for reproductions of paintings in the Prado. She's a great person to work with, so is her staff. So let me thank all of you in the office of the Fundación for your continuing help and friendship. Van Dyck was one of the great portraitists. His works were neither as powerful as those of Velázquez nor of Rembrandt. Nor did he have their depth of insight into human character. But his prosopographic range was arguably greater than theirs. He painted in the Netherlands, Italy, and England. The range of political figures he portrayed was wider than that of any of his peers. He was the favored portraitist of the Flemish upper bourgeoisie, so I show you the paintings of Franz Snyders and his wife, the painter, of the Genoese aristocracy, and of the English nobility. But he painted many other leading political and ecclesiastical figures too. So this is just to give you some sense of the range of Van Dyck's work. I will return to all these pictures in a moment. Although Van Dyck never went to Spain, the works I will show you today offer insight not only into the connections between Spain and Netherlands in the 17th century, but also into the international ramifications of Spanish politics. With the possible exception of Rubens, he was the finest of the Flemish portraitists, and there were many good ones. But by and large, it is a matter of taste Let me just tell you, you probably want to know, this has been up for long enough. This is Cardinal Bentivoglio, a Spanish cardinal who was candidate for the papacy in 1623, and the Abate Scalia, who was a diplomat and a priest at the same time. But by and large, it is a matter of taste whether one prefers a picture such as Rubens's portrait of a doctor on the right, Ludovicus Nomnius, and the painter by Van Dyck on the left of Franz Snyder's. As a portraitist of children, Van Dyck was almost Rubens's equal. So you have Van Dyck's portrait of the children of Charles I of England on the left, and Rubens's portraits of his own children, a wonderful portrait of his own children in Liechtenstein, in the Liechtenstein collection now in Vienna. When it comes to women, however, Van Dyck was notably inferior. There's another portrait of a Van Dyck child. We'll come back to him, and Rubens' infant on the right. When it came to women, however, Van Dyck was notably inferior, except in the Genoese pictures. Indeed, to compare the portrait by Rubens on the right of the Chapeau de Paille with almost any of his female sitters is to see how much his work in this area was wanting, even in the best of cases. So I'm going to come back to this portrait. Unfortunately, it's the only picture I have not been able to get a color reproduction of, and this shows his mistress when he was painting in England. So it's Van Dyck's mistress on the left, and Rubens's not his wife, but his wife's sister on the right. But to make such comparisons may be unfair. Let's try to get the measure of his achievement in its own terms. At first sight, Van Dyck's faces can seem bland, especially during his English period. So you see, we see these faces, and they don't seem especially interesting to us. But if one considers the works I've already shown and others, such as the great Bentivoglio, which you just saw, or the Elena Grimaldi, a fantastically beautiful Genoese portrait, which is now in Washington, D.C. When you see these pictures, or even the affecting ones of the Spanish merchant Geronimo Carchopin, or Giulio Cesarini, a young priest, a prelate and a scientist on the right, one realizes that he was a portraitist of compelling power, insight, and sensitivity. Of all the portraitists in the North, indeed, possibly even of all the portraitists of Europe, that is, of all those painters who devoted themselves to portraiture alone as their main means of earning a living, Van Dyck unquestionably enjoyed the highest status during his time. But it is worth remembering that even though the greatest of painters produced fine portraits, one only has to think of Raphael. You have a beautiful portrait of a cardinal by Raphael in the Prado, right next to some of his greatest religious paintings. But it's worth remembering that even though the greatest of painters produced fine portraits, until the 17th century, portraiture itself held a relatively low rank amongst the genres of painting. History painting, that is, religious and mythological painting, ranked much higher and was paid much more generously. But then the situation changed dramatically. The reasons for this have everything to do with the history of the Netherlands in the 16th century, and more specifically with the relations between the Netherlands and Spain. But that history, an entirely political one, turns out to be intimately wrapped up with the history of art, in ways that are still not adequately recognized, and that in the end cast dramatic light on Van Dyck, his work, and his status. So before I come to the paintings in the Prado, let me give you some sense of why this was so. Despite the relatively low status and market values of portraiture, the painters of the North had always excelled. In fact, Van Dyck's true predecessors were the 15th century Flemish painters, at least as much as the Italians he later came to admire. Painters like Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, religious painters above all, produced masterpieces of portraiture, such as Van Eyck's self-portrait in the National Gallery in London. This is the tradition from which Van Dyck came, or the marvelous portrait of a young woman by Roger van der Weyden in the National Gallery in Washington. These are just two of many examples that one could find. In an age before photography, portraits filled many of the functions they do now, acting as tokens of friendship, of memory, and as instruments of politics. Perhaps the finest example of these uses of portraiture are provided by Holbein's incomparable portraits of Erasmus and Thomas More. So these are the pictures you see. Thomas More commissioned that portrait of himself to send to Erasmus, and Erasmus commissioned Holbein to paint that portrait of himself to send to Thomas More in England. And then Holbein also painted a portrait of Christina of Denmark, which was sent to Henry VIII of England as a means of showing him what a potential wife might look like. How easy it now seems to understand, if one judges from this beautiful but rather unsparing work, why Henry might not have fallen in love with her, if this was all he had to go by. But how lucky, given his matrimonial history, this was for her. Remember, it's Henry VIII of England, so it was a good thing he didn't fall in love with her. Indeed, it is this portrait by Titian of Philip II of Spain that is said to have caused Mary Tudor to fall in love with him. And we know how badly that marriage went. You remember, it was apparently never consummated. And of course, you may remember, this is the picture by Antonis More. I'll come back to it down in the Prado across the way. She was, of course, 11 years older than Philip II. Of all the 16th century all-round painters to have produced portraits as well as other genres, Titian, of course, was the finest. Shall I show you two of Titian's greatest portraits? And it was he who had the most powerful influence on the work of the two great 17th century Flemings, Rubens and Van Dyck, along with a native tradition. But amongst all the 16th century specialists in portraiture, however, the most relevant for our topic today was unquestionably Antonis More, or Antonio Moro, as he was known both in Italy and Spain. From his earliest works on, portraiture in Spain and the Netherlands would always be tied together. Here is More's portrait, of course, of Mary Tudor, since it is inseparable from the complex and often tortured history of the Spanish dominions in the Netherlands. We may begin with the best known of the portraits that offer the clearest tokens of this connection, simply because of whom they represent. There are many examples, perhaps beginning with More's 1554 portrait of Mary Tudor, painted in the year of her marriage to Philip. It's a stiff state portrait of a tough woman, with just a glimmering of the humanity she managed for the most part to suppress. She seems stiff, but there's a little sign of humanity in her face. But there are also more sympathetic works, such as the beautifully painted portrait of that sophisticated and elegant favorite of Philip II, Antonio Pereno de Granvelle, or Granvella, as you say, Granvella. Quite different in its suavity from the much more tensely painted picture of Philip's half-sister, Margaret of Parma, which in its firm contours and tight painting fits more directly, as we shall see, into the local tradition of the time. So this is Philip II's half-sister, Margaret of Parma, and we're coming to her in a moment. And with these portraits, we move directly into the history of the relationship between Spain and the Netherlands. The story I'm about to tell you may at times seem to be very far from the history of art, but in fact, art stands at the center of the events that form the essential background to my topic today. So I am going to get to Van Dyck's portraits in the Prado in a moment, but in order to understand those portraits, we need to step back and look at some of the history of the Netherlands at the time of his youth. Under Charles V, son of Philip and Juana of Castile and grandson of the Emperor Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy, the old Burgundian and Habsburg domains in the Netherlands came together under the Spanish crown. Charles V himself was born in Ghent, and he spoke Flemish throughout his childhood. The areas we now call Holland and Belgium were not yet separated, and the entire region was at least nominally Catholic. But from the very beginning of his reign, Protestantism was a threat, and Charles issued his famous placards, his decrees against all forms of resistance to the official church, including, for example, anti-clerical plays and Bibles published in the vernacular. But the Protestant movement was unstoppable, and when Charles abdicated, I think he was tired, in 1555, he left the problems to his son Philip, 1 year after his unsuccessful marriage to Mary Tudor. Philip was obliged to enforce even stricter control over the Netherlands. In 1559, he himself left the Netherlands under the regency of Margaret of Parma, whom we've just seen, and of the regent Antonio Perrino de Granvelle. The Spanish-Netherlandish connection in the domain of portraiture could not be more clearly manifested than in these two works. But there's more. Granvelle, beginning a tradition of patronage that would continue until the deaths of Rubens and Van Dyck and long after, Granvelle, on the left, himself owned at least 2 works by Pieter Bruegel the Elder, including this lovely Flight into Egypt, which is from 1564. From this radical and perceptive form of local patronage, so you have to think of the cardinal sent by Philip to Flanders, and he buys a painting or buys 4 paintings, including this one by Pieter Bruegel. So you think of this man who is painted with so much more benignity than, shall we say, the painting of Margaret of Parma, and we gain some impression of his character. But this too, even when fortified into rigor and discipline in the field of politics, such as the tightening of Catholic control over an ever more restless country, was not enough to prevent the outbreak of rebellion in 1566. Granvelle tried to calm the country, increasingly Protestant, and then the rebels exploded in 1566, and the series of riots that marked the beginning of the revolt of the Netherlands against Spain started. Now, this revolt, as many historians and I myself have repeatedly pointed out, was not only a revolt against Spain, against Catholic Spain, against an increasingly repressive regime that came to be seen over the next 40 years as a hostile occupying regime. It was also a revolt against images. It was a war against paintings and sculptures and tapestries and ecclesiastical vestments. For the revolt of the Netherlands, which in the end continued for 80 long years, began with a series of attacks on images. Beginning in the southwest quarter of Flanders, in areas neighboring Charles V's birthplace in Ghent, Protestant rebels gathered in churches or sometimes riotously broke into them and tore down every image in sight. So I'm going to show you not a contemporary illustration of the image breaking, but a print by Martin van Heemskerk showing Old Testament destructions of images, which alluded to the contemporary destruction of images. The rioters, I think in this picture there's this astonishing sign of disrespect for a work of art. Now, where is it? Oh, this way. No. This is it? I still can't see it. Ah, there. Okay, so that's an astonishing sign of disrespect for a work of art. We could talk about this for hours, but never mind. So the rioters went into the churches and they destroyed paintings, sculptures, stained glass, liturgical objects, and even embroidered and woven liturgical vestments. Everything figured had to come down, be thrown away. Even the living images of God, the men who were representatives of the Catholic religion, were attacked. So you can see the priests being attacked in the lower right. I obviously don't know how to do. There we go. Okay. Mostly organized, but sometimes spontaneous, the riots spread like fire, reaching Antwerp itself on the night of August the 22nd, 1566, and then continuing on to the farthest north before burning itself out, at least temporarily, in remotest Friesland in the north. It was a war against images, but it was not just against images as the symbols of a hated regime. No, it was the public expression of a set of deep theological reservations against images. Sometimes scholars have claimed that theology does not affect the history of art, but the case of the Netherlands in the middle of the 16th century, like Germany in the 20s of the same century, proves how wrong they are. So I give you some examples, and I think this will also give you some background to the re-evaluation of portraiture later on. But people objected to images, the Protestants did, on the ground that it was against the prohibition of the second commandment, thou shalt have no graven images before me. Many members, indeed most of the Reformed religion, insisted that since God was uncircumscribable, unmaterial, how could he be depicted in material and circumscribed form? Although, of course, the Catholic response was to say that since Christ was made incarnate as man, he could also be represented as a man or in material form. Protestants insisted that images could not serve as intermediaries between humans and God, and too many people, they said, thought that those who were represented on images were actually present in the images themselves. The Catholic response, articulated in the final session of the Council of Trent, just 3 years before the Netherlandish iconoclasm, was not to address the basic principles of the Protestant objections, but to try to eliminate the abuses, to say that it was a mistake to worship the saint in the image, since the honor paid to an image passed to its prototype. You don't worship the Virgin in the image in front of you, you worship the Virgin represented by the image. And they made other complaints about the use of images, which Catholics try to defend. The Catholic side made it clear that the churches were to be visited and to ensure that these rules were carried out and that no new images with doubtful or new iconography should be tolerated. You might shake your heads and ask, how could all this start a revolt? But to ask such a question would be to underestimate how important images of all kinds were to people at the time, and how deeply what they stood for penetrated into daily lives. Furthermore, all the issues around images were utilized by the Protestant preachers whom Margaret of Parma tried so desperately to control in the tense days before the outbreaks of 1566. They became the focus of popular resentment. And it was easy enough to point out, as Martin Luther had often done, that the money the rich spent on the decoration of churches and the dead images adorning them would be better spent on the poor, on human beings, on the living images of God himself. So what, you may well be asking yourself, has this to do with portraiture? The answer is not as obvious as you might think. All the objections against images were sufficient to undermine the authority of pictures as an aid to religion and of pictures as the books of the illiterate, as the old dictum had it. So what happened was the status of religious paintings declined rapidly. But on an even more practical level, the iconoclasts had destroyed a huge number of religious paintings. Who could know, what painter could be sure that in such a climate their own productions would not be cut down? The fear was a realistic one, since even after Philip II sent the punitive Duke of Alva to replace Granvelle and Margaret and to tighten up control in the Netherlands, there were sporadic outbursts of further iconoclasm, particularly in Antwerp. So you can understand how in this climate, religious painting, the chief livelihood of all painters, could come to be threatened. The great school of Flemish painters practically stopped producing altarpieces in these years. The numbers of devotional paintings diminished, and painters allowed their old skill in the entirely less controversial area of portraiture to flourish. Even after order was restored, religious painting remained feeble, an exhausted genre. But the standard of portraiture in a country with so strong a tradition remained high. And so in the wake of Antonis More, distinguished but little-known painters like Adrian Thomas Kay, continued to produce works of the highest quality. And in fact, one of the loveliest recent acquisitions by the Prado is a family portrait, which you can see by Adrian Thomas Kay on the ground floor of the Prado. It's these kinds of paintings that were in circulation at the time Rubens was born in 1577 and Van Dyck in 1599, in the midst of the period when the war with Spain was a central feature of life in the Netherlands. So let me remind you, here is a portrait of the master at the age of, he was 63 when this was painted. There was 60 when this was painted, and there is the young Van Dyck at the age of 20. Rubens was born to a father who conducted an affair with a neurotic wife of the Prince of Orange, the leader of the resistance against Spain, and the man who was responsible for the creation of modern Holland. The new independent United Provinces of the Netherlands, to give it its correct name, may be said to have come into being with the signing of the 12 years truce in 1609, which determined the boundaries between the officially Catholic South, that's the area we now call Belgium, and the officially Protestant North. But painting would never be the same again. New genres came about, especially in the North, and portraiture grew still further in esteem. Rembrandt himself was born just 3 years before the truce was signed, opening a period of economic prosperity and artistic inventiveness and confidence in areas of painting that were entirely independent of the old tradition. And it was just a few months before this truce of 1609 that Rubens returned from Rome to Antwerp. From then onwards, he dominated the Antwerp school of painting until his death in 1640. It was also in 1609 that Van Dyck entered, at the usual age of 10, the workshop of Hendrik van Baarle. But within a few years, he was working for Rubens and producing paintings that soon came entirely under the old master's powerful influence. In these years, the churches in Antwerp began to be rebuilt and adorned anew, particularly under the beneficent eye and sometimes generous patronage of Philip II's daughter, the Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia. So this is a portrait by Rubens of the Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia, whom Van Dyck would only paint when she was much older, as we will see in a moment, and not very attractively. Many new and unexpected opportunities for religious painting arose in the restored and new churches, including, not surprisingly, the new Jesuit church in Antwerp, on which Van Dyck famously worked together with his master Rubens. But it cannot be said that Van Dyck's initial efforts in this direction ever reached the level of his portraiture, with only a few exceptions. So before we get to his portraits, I want to make some very brief comments about Van Dyck's religious paintings in the Prado. And I want to just say something briefly about this painting, which many of you may not have looked at. It's an important painting, for it shows Moses and the brazen serpent. This was the archetypical Old Testament subject, always cited in defense of the Catholic use of images against the criticisms of Lutherans and Calvinists. In the book of Numbers, chapter 21 tells of how God visited the Israelites in the desert with a plague of serpents. You can see the serpents wrapping around the leg there. And here, it's obviously recalling the Laocoon, that famous classical subject in Rome, by the way. But so God visited the Israelites in the desert with a plague of serpents to punish them for their dissatisfaction with him. Then God told Moses to set up a pole, as you can see there, with a bronze image of a serpent on it, and declared that all who looked on this image would be saved from the plague. In the Christian tradition, the salvific image of the serpent on a pole, some of you may know this, but it's an interesting, almost oxymoronic subject. The salvific image of the serpent on a pole was taken through the centuries to symbolize Christ on the cross. and his salvation of mankind from its sins. Needless to say, this was used especially by the Catholic defenders of images during the iconoclastic crisis as a justification for the use of images, because the image on the cross was, it was not a real serpent, it was a bronze image of a serpent which caused the death of the poisonous real serpents. This was the archetypal image that worked in an age when images were assailed for being useless, for being no more than dead images of wood and stone. In this way, one of Van Dyck's very first paintings connects directly to the great controversy from which his much greater work would soon grow. It's in a way, I know Alejandro Vergara, I think, is here, will disagree with me, but to tell the truth, it's still a comparatively awkward painting, though perhaps not as awkward as this picture, the Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine, which I'm not going to talk about because we will never this way get to the portraits. But there are two more great paintings in the Prado. There is this painting of Christ crowned with thorns, which Van Dyck painted. You have to realize he probably painted it when he was about 17 years old. So it's an immensely accomplished work. It is indebted to a painting by Rubens. It has the same tight musculature of the body, the same beautiful painting of the draperies. It's indebted to Rubens in this respect, but he's also remembering Titian, whom he must have seen in an engraving, because he hadn't seen this painting by Titian yet. But it's a remarkable, strong religious painting, which you can see upstairs in the Prado. This would have been the finest of the earliest paintings, early religious paintings by Van Dyck, painted all before he was 22, 21, which you can see upstairs. But the really great picture, of course, is the Taking of Christ, which is his masterpiece in the field of religious painting. Here, Van Dyck was his own man. It owes almost nothing to Rubens, nor to any other. It's an independent composition and the largest of his early years. I know of no other similar treatment of the subject, except perhaps in engravings which he may have known. The lighting effects are incomparably dramatic, from the way that flaming torch on the left, this flaming torch on the left casts its strong light on the agitated crowd of persecutors below, to how it glances off the leaves above, this wonderful set of reflections in the leaves over there. This is masterful painting, and illuminates the calm face of Christ, the face which looks so placid beside that face, besides underneath the menacing hands above him. This is a painting that exists, not surprisingly, in very many versions. And it's no wonder that it is one of the many works which Philip IV acquired for the Spanish royal collections when Rubens died himself in 1640, for the not inconsiderable sum of 1,200 guilders. That would have been a huge amount of money to pay for a young painter at the age of 19 when this was painted. I should add here that he also bought the Mocking of Christ from Rubens's estate, the previous picture, for 1,000 guilders, and that the earlier Brazen Serpent was in Alcazar by 1666. Spain and Flanders remained linked throughout all periods of stress by the love of painting. The religious works I've just shown are all very accomplished, and it's too often forgotten how young Van Dyck was when he painted them. But it was in his sensitive portraits, all painted with a kind of fluidity of brush that was far removed from the firm decisiveness of Rubens's treatment of flesh and color, that his true talents first emerged. One only has to look at works such as the portrait of Rubens's sister-in-law, Susanna Furma, and her daughter Clara. So here is Rubens painting Van Dyck at the age probably of 18, painting Rubens's sister-in-law and her daughter. You can see the sensitivity of his response to the physiognomies of his sitters, the elegance of their poses, and the shimmering paintwork of her drapery. That sensitivity also emerges in the liquid eyes of the great burgomaster of Antwerp and collector and patron of Rubens and Van Dyck, Cornelis van der Geest. This is a lovely, very small panel which you can see in the National Gallery in London. Even Raphael, I think, would have been impressed by the sprezzatura, the nonchalant elegance and cool gaze of Van der Geest. To say nothing of, that's actually the picture I wanted to talk about, the Raphaelesque portrait of Snyders, who is very elegant. No wonder then that Van Dyck should so immediately have appealed to the Genoese aristocracy when he first went there in 1621. The way, of course, had been prepared by Rubens, whose great book on the palaces of Genoa, owned by the very people who would now model for Van Dyck, appeared in 1622, the next year. Once more, even in the field of portraiture, Rubens had already reached great heights in his own Genoese pictures, especially of the wives of the Genoese noblemen. There is Rubens. I show you the most famous example of his Genoese pictures, the Brigida Spinola Doria in the National Gallery in Washington. In her, of course, was represented the union of by far the two most powerful families in Genoa, the Spinola and the Doria. And it is works such as these that inspired Van Dyck, even beyond the capacities we may already have expected from the promising young painter. This particular portrait by Rubens, now unfortunately cut down, clearly influenced Van Dyck's stupendous portrait of Elena Grimaldi. And then there were a few works which owed little to Rubens, but more to his other great hero at the time, Titian. There, you see these portraits of Filippo and Clelia Cattaneo offer a kind of homage to the Venetian painter's own wonderful pair of paintings of the Strozzi children. And throughout his Italian period and for many years after, Van Dyck was in constant pictorial engagement with Titian. Of all Van Dyck's Genoese connections, perhaps the most important in the context of my subject today was that of the Spinola family itself. This is a name I need hardly mention here in the Prado. For it was, of course, Ambrogio Spinola who is the central personality. This is Rubens's painting, by the way, of Spinola, because we only have some poor copies of Van Dyck's portraits of Spinola. But he, of course, is the central personality of the greatest painting ever made on the connection between the Netherlands and Spain. Already in 1603, Spinola had brought his own army to raise the siege of Ostend on the coast, on the northwest coast of Belgium, and was swiftly appointed commander-in-chief of the Spanish troops in the Netherlands against the Prince of Orange. But his most famous victory of all, as you know, was that of the capture of Breda in 1625. It is he, of course, whom we see at the very center of Velázquez's painting of Las Lanzas, receiving the keys of the town from Justin of Nassau, the bastard son of William of Orange. So I just was upstairs looking again at this head, and the signs of benignity and kindness on the face of the victor is quite remarkable and altogether different from that painting by Rubens. Velázquez shows the aging commander with the baton and sash of his authority, receiving the keys from Prince Justin with a kind of gentle magnanimity that represents the epitome of Velázquez's insight into character, very different from Rubens's brilliant portrait, which in and of itself would be regarded as one of the finest portraits of a 17th century military commander, were it not for the incomparable head here painted by Velázquez. Unfortunately, the original of Van Dyck's own portrait of the commander is lost, although the Prado does have a painting of his daughter, which you can see upstairs. This is Spinola's daughter, Polissena, but it's a long way from being one of his finest portraits. For whatever reason, it did not inspire him to the majesty or depths of insight which so many of his other Genoese portraits show him capable of achieving. So it's nothing like as great as that portrait, for example, of the Marchesa Balbi, also in Washington. But we will come back to Polissena in a moment. It is, in fact, the other works which I have shown you which give the measure of Van Dyck as a portraitist. And to this group, I'd just like to add, for example, the very great portrait of Theresia Lady Shirley, a Circassian noblewoman married to an English adventurer whom Van Dyck painted in Rome at about the time he painted his pedestrian picture of Polissena Spinola and of Guido Bentivoglio, former papal nuncio to Flanders, historian of the war between Netherlands and Spain, and narrowly defeated for the papacy by Urban VIII at exactly the time this one was painted. To compare the coloristic brilliance of the Shirley painting with the restrained palette of the Bentivoglio is to have the clearest possible sense of Van Dyck's chromatic inventiveness. But both pictures offer clear testimony to his sensitivity to character and also, in their shimmering surfaces, his astonishing virtuosity with a brush. So between 1627 and 1632, that's just after the defeat of Breda, Van Dyck was back in Antwerp, painting at a critical period for relations between Spain and the Netherlands. Indeed, Rubens was away on diplomatic missions on behalf of the Spanish regions for most of the time, thus perhaps offering Van Dyck an incentive to be in Antwerp. Rubens was working on diplomacy in Madrid and England, and Van Dyck went back to Antwerp. And it was shortly after his return to Antwerp that he painted one of the best and most poignant of his many beautiful pictures in the Prado. At first sight, this may not seem to be so remarkable. It may seem to be a relatively routine display of his now considerable powers as a painter, not just of bold heads, but of the trappings of war and power. So you see the armband, the baton of the commander. Here, there's the baton of the commander and the armband over there. It's a strong face, the eyes alert but worried. It is one of those pictures that make one want to know what it was that so troubled someone invested with such trappings of power and character. He's powerful, but he seems anxious. Even the clouded and rocky landscape setting seems to convey something of his mood. We know from the contemporary engraving by Paulus Pontius of this work that it shows Count Hendrik van den Berg, who played a role in the relations of Netherlands and Spain that is so complicated that it takes us back to the history with which I began my discussion. So I'm going to tell you very briefly about this strange man. He was born in Gelderland in the east. He was a cousin of Prince Frederick Hendrik, son of William the Silent, there's his head, and leader of the United Netherlands, whom Van Dyck would also portray. You would have thought that coming from there, he would have fought for the Netherlands against Spain, but he converted to Catholicism. He aligned himself with Spinola, and he took part in the capture of Breda, and he soon rose to become member of the Council of State. When Spinola finally departed the Netherlands in 1628, he left Van den Berg in charge of the Spanish land forces there. But after 2 serious losses near his birthplace, he was suspected, not surprisingly, of treason, and he was soon replaced by the Marquess de Santa Cruz. As a result of that, perhaps, he joined the conspiracy of Flemish noblemen who entered into negotiations with the United Provinces, with Holland, with a view to enlisting French support and freeing the country from Spanish rule. So here's a complicated guy. He starts off, he's living in Holland, he turns to Spain, he rises in Spanish power, and then when he loses his battles, he goes back to fight against Spain. We can never know all the ingredients that make strong men become traitors. In this case, arguably more than once. But it is entirely characteristic of Van Dyck that he should be able to convey, in what otherwise might have been a relatively straightforward portrait of confident power, some sense of the man's divided personality, so feeling for the agonies he must even then have gone through. This is a picture which reminds me of a similar English portrait of Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Stafford, who first in England, first sided with Parliament, then sided with a king, and then when he lost battles in Ireland on behalf of King Charles of England was sent to the scaffold and died there, hung by or executed by the king who would follow him a few years later. So they both have the sad and troubled look for the same vacillation between the poles of power. But let me stay for a moment with the relations between Spain and the Netherlands. Van Dyck probably also painted a portrait of Van den Bergh's successor as commander of Spanish troops in the Netherlands, the Marqués de Santa Cruz, but it is too boring to show you here. This is a painter who needed to know his sitters and to get a feeling for the complexity of their characters in order to have the best brought out in him. When, for example, we come to this portrait of the next commander-in-chief of the Spanish troops in the Netherlands, Francisco de Moncada Marqués de Aytona, who took over in 1633, the results are less interesting than the moody depiction of Van den Bergh. You see in civilian garb, his face is unwrinkled, self-satisfied, one might say. He has a shiny forehead, untroubled. There is none of the doubt that seems to crease the features of Henry van den Bergh's portrait. Indeed, beside the portrait of Moncada, even a work that I had always regarded as bland, that of the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand himself, seems interesting. I thought it was boring, but next to Moncada, this one upstairs looks not so bad. Both painters both he and Rubens, produce many versions of portraits of the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, and they were many times copied. He became the successor to his Aunt Isabella at the age of 22 in 1631. And how brilliantly Van Dyck manages to convey the young man's shy and soft immaturity, his slightly effete look, a look that belies his subsequent military success at the Battle of Nordlingen when he defeated the Swedish army before making a triumphal entry into Brussels in 1634. A year later, Rubens prepared the decorations for the triumphal entry of the Cardinal Infante in Antwerp, one of the greatest of his own late achievements in the field of painting as propaganda. And so, as always, Rubens is there from the beginning to the end. The older master loved the younger one right from the beginning, and Van Dyck's respect for him never ceased. So you should remember that Rubens's connection with Spain went back to 1602 when he was sent by Vincenzo Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua, to Philip III on a diplomatic mission. And Rubens, of course, then right from the start is working both as a painter and a diplomat. He takes new and old paintings for Philip III and above all for his favorite, the Duke of Lerma. Already at this time, Rubens copied that great painting upstairs, which we've already seen, of Charles V on horseback. And then in order to win Lerma's favor, Rubens did the equestrian portrait of him. As a kind of artistic response, he takes that profile picture of the horse and he gives it a three-quarter view. He gives that horse movement. And of course, this is Rubens's first masterpiece, the first great equestrian portrait of the 17th century. Indeed, one of the great equestrian portraits of all time. No wonder that it should have influenced Van Dyck over and over again. He remembered it in his Genoese portrait of Giulio Antonio Brignole Sale at the age of 21, and then for his equestrian portrait of Moncada, which here at least shows Moncada in his role of Commander-General of the Spanish troops. But Van Dyck was not done with this type yet, for he used it once more in perhaps the very finest of his equestrian portraits, that of Charles I of England, painted at a time when Spain and Britain, ironically enough, were at the height of their enmity. He's painting Moncada for Spain, copying Rubens. He's painting Charles I of England, copying or adapting Rubens. It is in this context, too, that one thinks of Rubens's last major diplomatic effort. In political terms, this effort failed. In pictorial terms, it gave the aging painter a new lease of life. For Rubens himself went to Spain in 1628 in an effort to see if he could prepare the way for the peace he himself dreamed about between the Catholic South, where he lived, and the Protestant North. In Madrid, Rubens acquainted himself again with a work of Titian. I show you Rubens's copy on the left of Titian's famous painting of the Andrians on the right. There I also show you the other great painting of the Bacchanal of the Andrians. So Rubens on the right and Titian on the left. His late style, Rubens's late style, would testify to the lessons he learned from Titian's own late style, studying it for hours on end in the Royal Palace and in the Escorial. From Madrid, Rubens went to England in the hope that he might move Charles I to enter into an alliance first with Holland and then with Spain. Thereby, he would create peace in the whole of the Netherlands. But the longed-for alliance never worked out, and Rubens retired to his country estate, happily marrying the 16-year-old Hélène Fourment, and painting as actively as he ever did one of the great marital portraits. It was, by the way, from his country estate, that he directed the preparation of the pictures for Philip IV's Torre de la Parada that still hang in the Prado. But even though the English expedition was a failure, it was once more Rubens who prepared the way for Van Dyck. He had barely left England when Van Dyck arrived in April 1632. And with him he brought portraits of Marie de Medici of France and of the Archduchess Isabella. Archduchess Isabella, after Breda, of course, had retired to the Descalzas Reales here in Madrid, and she is shown here in the habit of the Descalzas Reales. Van Dyck full length on the right, Rubens on the left. So Van Dyck arrives with these pictures in England in the hope that he might be commissioned to paint the King and Queen of England. Probably not a very good choice of pictures to bring with him. It is interesting to note that he should have brought female portraits, perhaps two of the least beautiful of all 17th century regents with him, since it is clear that in England his strength would not lie in female portraiture. Perhaps he found English fashion unappealing. Perhaps it is just the women themselves who were too stiff, or perhaps our own taste is substantially different from that of the time. And so we have pictures like the Beatrice, Countess of Oxford, although she was Dutch in origin, which counts, in fact, amongst the best of his English pictures of women. He swiftly married a local girl, Maria Riven, who by all accounts was a good looker. Indeed, already in 1658, one of the first English writers on painting, William Sanderson, wrote in colloquial English mixed with Italian that she was a bouncing bona roba to endure forever. The praise is slightly hard to believe, but perhaps here too tastes have changed. But notice, as Sanderson did, notice that she holds up a rosary to the viewer, as if to caution him from thinking that she was too much of a good thing, a good and bouncing thing, to caution him, in other words, against her alleged carnality. At the end of the all, Sanderson says she seems to be saying, "Look upon this, sir, the rosary, and you shall never sin." All this may have been a bit too much for Van Dyck, and so perhaps it is not surprising that he should have chosen to sin with a young woman who was by all appearances more seductive than his off-putting wife. I'm really sorry I have not been able, it's in a private collection, not been able to get a good slide of this. Apparently this beautiful young woman, Margaret Lemon, his mistress, was prone to violent fits of jealousy when society ladies were in her husband's studio, which must have been often. Perhaps this alone prevented him from devoting more than cursory attention to most of his female sitters. Perhaps this alone is why they so often seem curiously uncarnal and unseductive. But I admit this is pure speculation. What we do know, however, is that Margaret Lemon must have had double standards, for Van Dyck seems to have shared her with his best friend Endymion Porter, who is shown here together with him in the lovely oval portrait upstairs. They hold onto the rock of friendship in the foreground. It's not, in my view, one of his most compelling works. And Endymion Porter, buttoned up in his white silk outfit, seems a little self-satisfied, as perhaps indeed he was. Here's a close-up. The two of them seem the very picture of foppish elegance. Porter was a good servant of the king and had in fact accompanied him to Madrid in 1623 when Charles I hoped to marry the daughter of Philip IV before he finally settled on Henriette Marie of France. That marriage, if he had married the daughter of Philip IV, would certainly have changed the balance of power at the time and may indeed have brought about the peace that had so eluded Rubens. Not surprisingly, it was Porter who served as one of Charles's main intermediaries with artists. He sent Rubens's payment for the banqueting house ceiling in London, and it was he who first acquired one of Van Dyck's history paintings for the king. If Porter seems a little stiff here, he seems a little more relaxed there's a family portrait of Porter and his wife and sons. I show you an engraving of it because that picture is completely unavailable. Despite his supposed affair with Margaret Lemon, he is also said to have been passionately devoted to his wife, whom you see here, and family. Typically 5 of their 12 children died in infancy. But it's interesting how much more sensitively Van Dyck portrays him and the boys than he does her. Again, he couldn't seem to rise to insight in his portraits of women in England. From these works, one has only a limited sense, however, of Van Dyck's massive achievement in that country. Porter's children, even from this poor engraving, give some sense of the fulfillment of the promise of the Catania children in Genoa, although nothing in the Prado, except perhaps the Van den Berg picture and the one I have yet to show you, the one with which I will conclude, can really match the power, the swagger, or the melancholy of Lord Danvers, great English aristocratic commander, or Algernon Percy, 10th Earl of Northumberland, or the double picture of Killigrew and Crofts, the finest of his double portraits. I love this painting. They both sunk in melancholy and thoughtfulness. And then, of course, there's the greatest of his mythological works, which I can never resist showing, the silvery picture, the Cupid and Psyche, which he painted for Charles I himself. Perhaps it was the renowned collections of Charles I that inspired him to these heights. And it was from these collections of Charles that the greatest collector of Flemish works in Spain, other than the king himself, the Marquis de Leganés, acquired some of his most important pictures. He owned no fewer, Leganés owned no fewer than 1,333 paintings, according to the inventory of his estate in 1655, including several great Titians and Rubenses, and no fewer than 11 Van Dycks, including the picture of the Marquess d'Aitona, and of course those of himself and his wife, Polissena. So here, Polissena, whom you've seen before, she, of course, was the wife of the Marquess de Leganés. In the collections, it's a poor image of the Banco de Santander, a poor reproduction. Leganés had long been close to Spinola, in fact, for he had fought under him at Jülich, in the Palatinate, and in Breda, and alongside the Cardinal Infante at Nordlingen in 1634. He was Privy Council, Grand Master of the Order of Santiago, and President, again, of the Council of the Netherlands. Soon he became the favorite of the Conde Duque de Olivares, and even adopted his name in 1627, combining it with that of the king to make himself Felipez de Guzman, Marqués de Leganés. In the painting of around 1630, he looks rather tired, and the work lacks the penetration of Rubens's drawing. You see how penetrating Rubens's drawing is, and in fact, it also lacks the evident military fire of Van Dyck's engraving, which was made by Pontius a few years earlier. So that's Van Dyck representing Leganés before he seems to have gotten so tired. Perhaps Leganés was stronger in the field than when he retired to his paintings. The only other portraits in the Prado I have not yet mentioned are the swaggering and slightly surly portrait of a young man, once identified as Rubens's engraver, Pontius. He's clearly a commander of some sort. We need to know who he is. He's kitted out in the kind of super fashionable finery which Van Dyck was so good at portraying. And then there's the fine and alert portrait of a man with a chitarrone, and it would be good to know who he is as well. This is an accomplished symphony in black, as Whistler might have said, to be set in the company of a most interesting small group of very different musicians whom Van Dyck painted. If there are any people who want to write a nice essay on the history of art, I suggest Van Dyck's portraits of musicians. You have this portrait of a man, this elegant portrait of a man with a chitarrone. These portraits include the organist of Antwerp Cathedral, Enrique Liberti. There's a very good version of this here in the Prado. It's debated, but it's certainly a very high quality. Then there's this master of the King of England's music, Nicholas Lanier, who also played a role in helping Charles build his collections. And finally, the wonderfully robust, these are all musicians, the wonderfully robust portrait of the print dealer and musician, here shown as a bagpiper, François Langlois. But my time is coming to an end, and we must leave the examination of this wonderfully varied group for another occasion. I want to conclude my talk with what I think is the most moving of Van Dyck's portraits in the Prado, that of the Antwerp painter Martin Reichardt. It's just been cleaned. It's a somber, little discussed work, even though it is one of his finest. Besides it, Reichardt's own works, he's a painter, seem slight. This is a landscape. He did some landscapes, and this is one of his landscapes in the Prado. But look more carefully, I'll go back, at this picture of an obscure Antwerp painter. He was never well known. Though obscure, he has the grandeur of a potentate. His frontal bearing, his fur-lined coat, his scarlet robe beneath it, all testify to that. We don't know why he seems to be wearing the clothes of a Pole. On his head, he wears a fur-rimmed green hat that sinks into the blackness behind him. The scarlet and the fur seem to break out of the dark picture with unexpected brilliance, as does trimmed but masculine beard, more substantial than Van Dyck's own goatee. His heavy-lidded eyes at first seem sad, but they are alert and sensitive. In showing all these qualities, but above all in conveying an expression of melancholy modulated by sensitivity and insight, Van Dyck excelled, and significantly, no more than in his portraits of other painters, not only in painting, but in the famous etchings of the iconography too. So I show you two pictures of, Van Dyck was a superb etcher. He produced these etchings of Antwerp people, and the most melancholic of them are often the painters. Here is young Bruegel the Younger and Jan de Waal. I wonder, though, how many of you have noticed what is missing from this sensitive depiction of a painter? For what he lacks is a hand. He could not have held, as every painter, well, you see, he's got his right hand, so he could paint with a brush, but he could not have held, as every painter at the time had to do, a brush in one hand and a palette or a maul stick, that's the stick which you lean your hand against when you're painting a canvas or a panel. Couldn't have held it with his other hand. And yet, despite his handicap, as Hans Flieger so finely put it in the most recent catalogue raisonné of Van Dyck's works, he sits enthroned on a grand scale. He looks the viewer straight in the eye, for all the world like a self-assured East European magnate. His biography suggests no reason why he should have worn such a costume. It's never been noticed what a close resemblance this profound picture bears to that of another painter who loved dressing up and who showed himself in the dress of some great potentate at precisely the time of his deepest personal and financial distress. I refer, of course, to Rembrandt's Self-Portrait of 1656 in the Frick collection in New York, one of the great masterpieces in the history of portraiture. The picture of Reichardt, I think, holds its own against the Rembrandt. But it is hard not to think of the Rembrandt as offering a kind of homage to Van Dyck's portrait. For in that massive hand with which Rembrandt testifies to the very tactility of his painting, in that hand is the hand on the right, which stands in the same place where poor Reichardt should, he places a maulstick, the instrument which Reichardt could not have held, the instrument which supported his other hand as he, Rembrandt, applied the kinds of paint that Van Dyck himself all his life strove to avoid. Van Dyck painted smoothly, Rembrandt painted in great dabs of paint, as you can see from the painting. And that maulstick in Rembrandt doubles as an imperial scepter, a great baton of command, like all those batons we saw in Van Dyck, testifying to his pride in being a painter, and above all, to his sense of the power of painting over all earthly and political power. It is this that he seems to want to restore to the obscure, one-armed Antwerp painter. If my hypothesis is correct, the greatest work of Rembrandt's maturity, painted as a kind of consolation against the blows of fortune, serves as a tribute to the proudest of Van Dyck's works in the Prado. Thank you.